But welcome, good to have you. Next, we have Dr. Buka, who is the chair for media department in the Multimedia University, and great to have you as well.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
Last but not least, we have David Ohito, who is the digital editor with us here at The Standard. Karibu sana. All right, let's start off with some of the things that's been happening over the weekend. Of course, one of the big stories that has been covered, and we here on KTN News and The Standard have been doing very huge coverage, is the elections in Tanzania. And I'll start with you, Gadara, on first of all, your take on how the coverage has been. I know we have reporters in several cities within Tanzania just to bring us results and how things have been going. But your take on how it's gone so far?
Well, I actually think that the media has done a pretty commendable job. I mean, they sent in, especially the Standard sent in reporters, I think, in advance of the elections. I think it was almost like a month.
Close to a month and a half, actually.
Yeah,
we had Ben Kitili's camp.
Precisely, Ben Kitili had gone down, you know, and stuff. So it was good to actually see them hashing out issues from there. I think it's the first time we're seeing such coverage of a regional election as opposed to just the national one. So on that score, I think the media has done pretty well. I like that they're following up while they're there. I just have one beef.
As usual. There's always something with Gadara.
I mean, there has been, KTN also has been guilty of this. They've been reporting that of how the CCM, the governing party, is headed for a win in both presidential and parliamentary elections, even though they are yet to count even half of the votes. So I'm not sure why I mean, I feel like almost the media is jumping the gun, you know. And they started this almost the day after the results are coming out.
One could argue that it is factual in the sense that
John
Pombe Magufuli has been leading all along.
Well, I mean, the polls are from before were pretty tight, you know. And this is very reminiscent of what happened in the Kenyan election. And this is how you build perceptions that people think that once my strongholds start coming in, then the election is being rigged. You know, when you've counted less than half of the votes, there's really no call, unless you're doing your exit polling or stuff like that. You really have no leg to stand on to say somebody is winning. All you can say is he's leading. You know. Now, when you say he's winning, and then later on it turns out, it's the wording you're using and the expectations that the media is creating. You know, that somebody is definitely headed to a win when all he is of what has been counted. He's leading.
So the issue here maybe is the terms that they're using.
Yes, I think it's the terms and the expectations
and
that you
perceptions.
Okay, yeah. Dr. Buka, your take on the coverage, and well, according to Gadara, maybe we need to use terms like leading as opposed to winning. Although if he's leading right now, it means so far he's winning.
Not necessarily. I think looking at the votes that have been counted, which might not necessarily mean that, you know, they're winning. And so it's a question of the kind of words that we use and the perceptions, and that is likely to create in the minds of those that are watching. But I think the coverage has been commendable, as Gadara has put it. Very good coverage, especially from the Standard KTN News. And I think we are now seeing part of the advantages of having an all-news station, you know, because, and a regional outfit at that. So the elections have been given the prominence they deserve. And, you know, for the first time, I think Kenyans have really followed the Tanzanian elections because of the kind of attention that it has received and the kind of prominence that those elections have received. So we are seeing a lot more of regional coverage as opposed to, you know, just getting stories from, you know, Tanzanian reporters. We're having a lot more reporters going into to cover the elections, and that's commendable.
Okay,
yeah.
David Ohito, on the digital front, how have we done?
Very good. We try to get information as is released by the Electoral Commission in Dar. But what we realize that the flow of tallies from polling station is not as fast as has been in Kenya. So quite a fair challenge for
the has been in Kenya, did you say?
Yes.
You are here in 2013?
Honestly, yes. You could see that the electronic board with, you know.
The one that got stuck.
Yes, that got stuck. So I think that has been a challenge for our journalists who are used to faster release of info so that they could relate. That has been a fair challenge for them. But also the language of communication, which is basically Swahili, and trying to get those who can competently interpret results as they are announced in Swahili has also slowed down the way we get info here, rather than when we could pick bites which are in English. But above all, I think the journalists, Tanzania is a very vast country, have tried their best. Yes.
All right, Dr. Booker, before you, I know you want to say something, but in regards to language and interpretation, this is Tanzania, which is Swahili speaking, mainly Swahili speaking, and Swahili for Kenyans is fairly understandable. We can just about get by. But now what happens when you go to regions, for instance, that speak French? Or German, or when we now go to the greater Africa, how do we overcome that challenge?
Part of it is in investing in the kind of journalists that we have, having them be competent in various languages. And I know that in terms of training, very few universities have courses, for example, in Swahili for communication. At Multimedia, we have one course that tries to do that. But again, I believe that there's room for improvement, because you cannot learn Kiswahili, in 4 or 5 months. It has to be an ongoing process. So that investment in the kind of journalists who can report in some of those languages. Interestingly, when I was following the elections, even for me as a Kenyan, just trying to follow through the Swahili, it takes a while for me to first translate back into English, before I can make sense out of it. But I think we have some journalists locally who are, very conversant in the language, and they were able to report competently. But of course, taking into account that, the language issue and the kind of Kiswahili that, the Tanzanians speak and the one that Kenyans speak, is somewhat different. And so that takes a while. And so a lot of investment. I think it's something that we need to think about, not just as media houses, but even for us in training, not just in training in English, for example, but looking at some of the languages that are spoken within the region, even vernacular languages, that maybe it's time for us to rethink, the language of communication, and not just limit it to English. So that's something that's
one of the challenges.
Yeah.
Gadara, I don't know what you think on the language issue, especially now that you're talking about terms, and when you look at we'll come to vernacular, but when you look at something like Swahili, you may have one word that probably means 3 different things, depending on the sentence and depending on how you put it. How do you overcome that barrier of ensuring that we are accurate in what we report?
Well, I think there are 2 things here. First, the media has to, at least the Kenyan media there, has to define what its audience is. Are you beaming to Tanzanians or to Kenyans? If it's to Kenyans, then you use language that is understandable by Kenyans. I also think that we need to be careful about adopting the models that we see other international networks doing. Essentially, this idea of parachuting in journalists and then getting them out, so they don't spend as much time understanding the nuances of whether it's language or politics within these regions. So yes, it's nice that we went in a month before, but perhaps we could look at a model where we hire local journalists in Tanzania, who know the layout, who know what's being meant, and then perhaps we could then train them in speaking sort of Kenyan Swahili, if you will, in that sense. But I'll say one other thing about the coverage of the election itself. One other thing that I'm a bit not too happy about is the coverage of the issue. I think the election has very much been covered almost the way the media covers Kenyan elections, which is really more about the politics of things, and not really the issues. And it would have been nice to see a distinction made. For example, what is the Kenyan stake in this election? What are the 2 leading candidates saying? Do they have differences in how they would approach us? We know we've had problems with people, Kenyans, being required to have either work permits or being kicked out of there. We had a newspaper, the East Africa, kicked out of Tanzania. supposedly because of a cartoon, but we need to be able to have, or to put the leading candidates and to articulate what their positions are in regard to Kenyan interests. So when you speak to a Kenyan audience, you can say, well, actually, this is the guy we would prefer, even though we don't have a say in who they elect, but we can have an idea of what we would expect as Kenyans once so-and-so takes power. Is it more of the same? Will there be any changes, etc.? We know even within the EAC, Tanzania's commitment to the EAC has been questioned, and stuff. So I would really have loved to see the issues articulated, what's the election being run on.
Yes, Dr. Buka.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to add that one of the things that has been evident, even in the English news locally, is we don't, the sound bites are also in Kiswahili. From the elections, especially when the journalists are interviewing, some of the top contenders, or those that are seeking elective positions, and I don't know why that has been the case. Part of it could be that either the fact that they are not able to get English versions of the interviews, or very little has been done to try and translate. And what has been said. Of course, with translation, sometimes meaning is lost, and so there's an advantage of playing, the soundbite as it is. But I think there needs to be effort by the journalists themselves to try and make meaning for those that are not, that cannot be able to speak the language. But some of the things that Gadara is raising, what's the how does Kenya stand to benefit or lose based on which party takes the lead? I think part of that has been covered, and not as extensively as we'd have wanted it to, though. But when, for example, KTN News set camp there about a month and a half ago, some of that, we saw some of that. Of course, not to the extent that we would want to see. The challenge of doing that right now is that all eyes are on who's going to win the election. And so maybe going forward, I think it would be important then that after the election, that is given a lot more coverage. Okay. But I think expecting that to be done now, when everybody's waiting to see who's going to win the election, would be, I think that would be lost if that was covered now. Yeah.
Ohito, in terms of what Gadara brought out, Kenyan journalists or journalists from other countries covering politics the way they cover their own. As Kenya, we do know how we do our thing. And when we go to Tanzania, maybe it's slightly different. Did we have an objective eye to understand the politics of the day in that particular nation and report it as per that, or do we look at it from our perspective?
Well, I think we remained objective, and let me remind Gadara that there's nothing professionally wrong with saying a candidate is in the lead. It's just like a football match. If it is halftime and one team is 1-0 up, you cannot... at that point. Yes, that is what it means. And that is very factual, very accurate. There's no way you'd expect a journalist to interpret the difference of 500 million votes between two candidates, other than saying so-and-so is ahead with 500,000 votes. Very accurate, very professional, and that is how to tell the story. In fact, it would even have been better if there went data, say Magufuli, his graph is this long, and Loasa's graph is at this
I think
place.
His issue was not necessarily that he's leading, but the fact that we say he's winning. He hasn't won.
When you lead,
it's like a race. The marathon is not over until you cross the tape.
That is what leading means.
Actually, the analogy of marathon and of sports is actually a bit misplaced here. Because actually what we are having is, the votes that come in from wherever they are counted, if you have less than half, the election is already done. They've already voted. If you have less than half, there's no way you can say who's winning. And this is my point. And don't forget, right now we've got the Chadema guys saying that, well, what we are hearing is not necessarily reflective of how the vote was actually cast. They're having the same issues that we had in 2013 and even worse in 2008. But you know, the jumping the gun, the declaration of some people. I mean, look at your own headline here in the Standard that says Magufuli is headed for victory. You know,
Surely he is headed there. We have mapped out where the votes are.
Yes, he may be leading, but the idea that because he is ahead, he is winning, you know, is what got us into trouble. You know, in 2008, got us again into trouble in 2013. It's almost like we don't learn. You know, yes, he is leading, but let us qualify this. You know, to say he is winning, I think is a bridge too far, if you ask me.
How does that work, Gadara, from your opinion? How does that work to polarize or have the opposition feel like it was not fair? Because like you've mentioned, the vote has already been cast. There's nothing else that's going to change between now and then.
Yeah.
So all we're saying is he is leading, and if he continues the way he is, he's the winner.
Yes, but to say he is winning is very different from saying he's leading. And the second thing is, when we have, like now, pretty close run elections, people will do respond to this pressure, so the perceptions that the media creates, and it's got to be careful. You know, I think we really need to be careful about what perceptions we are creating. You know, because if it turns out that a bit later on they start, other guys start coming in, then suddenly you are no longer winning. You know, it creates issues. You know, where people think that, as they did in 2008, that okay, the election now is being rigged. You know, people are changing numbers because so and so was winning. You know, I'm just my point is that we need to be careful about perceptions we have, especially in this close-run, polarized election, so that we don't engender certain opinions that tomorrow might come and bite us in the ass. You know.
Okay.
I would remind you that
behind, I guess, is a better term to use. But anyway, yeah. Now that we're on air.
I'll remind Gadara, my good friend, that I looked at about 8 wire stories, and all these by very authentic media houses: Reuters, AP, AFP, BBC, Voice of America, SABC. Our headline is not different from what they said. So I don't know the kind of journalism that Gadara expects us to practice.
Make it right just because BBC have done the same thing.
Not really, but you know, that is the standard practice of reporting elections all over the world. I mean, if a candidate is in the lead, you cannot reverse.
No, you can say he's in the lead. I have no problem with saying he's in the lead. To say he's winning is a different thing. That's the point I'm saying.
Dr. Booker, are these just semantics? Are we splitting hairs on non-essentials? As a lecturer and one who operates in a classroom setting, is there a language that is acceptable to use, especially in this kind of event, given that it could create a certain frame of mind?
I think there's a way that journalists are trained to think and to look for, you know, what's the headline? I mean, what's the big thing
catchy?
here? What's catching?
What sells?
What sells, thank you. And that then becomes the driving force, even in terms of deciding what headlines and what words to use. But, you know, as Gadare says, maybe it's time for us to rethink that. You know, taking into account the fact that we have seen, you know, from history, that that has not been the case, where a candidate is leading but does not necessarily win the election at the end. And the kind of perceptions that is likely, you know, to create, which would be the lessons learned, you know, from election coverage in the past. But I would not blame media for the kind of headlines that we are seeing, because that is the orientation, that's the kind of thinking, you know, that journalists have been trained to have. That's the practice, and that's why Ohito is even pointing to certain examples of how other media houses have covered it. But that does not mean that it is not time for us to sit down and ask ourselves, is this the way to go, you know, in terms of coverage of elections in a continent or a context that is highly polarized, you know, along, for example, ethnic lines, that is very divided. You know, you have government, you have the, you know, the ruling party, and you have opposition. You have a transition, and how to manage that in such a way that it doesn't, you know, fuel conflict going forward would be something for us to think about. And I believe that, you know, that even after this kind of coverage, that media houses sit down and ask themselves, how did they do? But the motivation always is, what is it that sells? And if that is what sells,
Then
then Ohito is going to run the headline that
we work for our audiences, and we owe them answers. Any audience member who picks up the newspaper today will not ask Gadara how the election faring is and the nitty-gritty. They will ask the question, who is winning? And they expect the editor and the reporters to speak to them, and which is why we are saying Magufuli is winning, and we justify by statistics that after 100 stations is way ahead by 500,000 votes. We are right. I have no apologies about that headline, and I think it continues.
All right, let's move on to something else.